In this video, let me show you how you can explore the potential savings in your documentation. My name is Matthias. I've been working as a freelance technical author for over 20 years, and I've put all the experience that I've made during this time in the authoring system SingleFeeder. So, which are the factors that lever the costs in your documentation? There are four major levers: the total amount of your documentation, the reuse rate, the share of translations, and the number of languages that you translate into. So first of all, we have to relate these major levers to each other. In order to do that, it is a good idea to put them into a time frame. For example, 1 year. So first of all, you need to know the volume that you document per year. To have a factor to work with, it is best to convert the total volume of your documentation per year into pages. In order to be able to be precise and later on relate this to the share of translations that you do, you could set each page to a given number of characters. It has proven well to apply 1500 characters to each page. So that means letters, numbers, and blanks. I will do this later on and convert all my documents to the respective number of pages. The next thing we need to know is the reuse rate. The reuse rate affects the new documents to be created as well as the translations. How can you calculate your reuse rate? You take the volume you have documented in 1 year and compare it to the volume that you have created in the previous year. You subtract the difference from the total volume, and that gives you your reuse rate. Let's assume in 2015 you published 400 pages of documentation. In 2016 you created 100 new pages and in total also published 400 pages. That means you have reused 300 pages, and that corresponds to a reuse rate of 75%. If you do not know the volume of documentation published in 1 year, it is fair enough to estimate it or take other corporate figures to base your estimate on. If you do this, start by estimating the number of pages that you create completely new, for example because you are describing new products. If you edit existing documents to do this, you could also estimate the volume of changes that you make. To get a more precise picture in this, you could estimate the number of pages with a few changes, with some changes, and with many changes. You could simply quarter the page. Experience has shown us that one page of 1500 characters contains about 12 sentences. Respectively, 1/4 of a page would correspond to editing 3 sentences, half a page would correspond to 6 sentences, and 3/4 of a page would correspond to 9 sentences. Add these figures to the number of pages you created completely new in order to calculate the total volume of change that you've made to your documentation. For this calculation, we assume that you will only change sentences if you want to write new content, which then has to be translated later on. The reuse rate already gives you a first hint at potential efficiencies that you can use when creating new documents, that is, writing documents in your original source language. How long does it take you to find a text template that you can reuse? And how often do you need to do this to create a new document? Consider that this may require you opening a couple of documents and not finding the text that you were actually looking for. So calculate the time that you need for this in minutes, take your hourly rate and calculate the costs that you need to find texts for reuse in your existing documentation. Imagine what would happen if you could reduce this time by dividing the time that you need by a factor that you think is realistically achievable by, for example, having a system that helps you to organize your documents in a better way. That already shows you the first savings potential in your documentation. However, this is by far not all. In the beginning, I have said that the big levers are reuse rate and translation. In translation, you can move much more. Let's assume the following situation, which is quite often a scenario found in many companies. You write a document and have it translated, and then later on you edit the document to develop it further. Or you create new versions either by editing this document or taking it as a template for other documents. And then, sometimes later, let's assume a few months, you need a translation of that updated document. So now you know that you have only changed a part of the document, but you don't know exactly where your changes are. And of course, this drives translation costs up. Of course, you can use a translation memory system to counterbalance this effect. However, it is only compensated to a certain degree. Our experience has shown that in these cases there's usually a potential of the factor 2 to 3 left. To tap into this additional potential, you will need extra software. However, with good organization and formatting which can be read by machines, you can already do quite a lot. Let's come back to the next lever, the translation. To estimate the effect that translation can have, you have to first of all assess how much of your total documentation do you translate and into how many languages. For a start, it is a good idea to assume that you translate all your languages to the same amount. That gives you a good basis, and later on you can refine the results by going down into more detail. To do that, you can either apply an index factor to the overall result, or you can redo the calculation individually for each of your languages. Coming back to the example I just gave you before, you may have only changed 30% of your document. However, as you don't know where the changes were made and you can't filter them out, you will have to retranslate the complete document. So the savings potential here obviously is 70%. The initial question, however, was what would be the potential of your complete documentation, that means across all your documents. In order to calculate that, you need to factor in your reuse rate. We have just calculated the reuse rate, and now we can assume that the reused texts are already available with their respective translations, as long as they have to be translated at all. So that means in order to calculate the potential, we only need to look at the new texts now. And that means we can subtract the amount of reused text from the complete volume of text. To estimate your annual translation costs, you simply take the result of that subtraction and multiply it by the number of languages you work into. This gives you the theoretically lowest value that you can get of, or in other words, the highest potential which is possible. Compare that to your actual translation costs in order to find out how high your potential is. The difference of both these values gives you the potential that is in the translation of your documents. Let's come back to our example. You publish 400 pages per year and 100 pages are new. Let's assume that you translate every second document into 2 languages, and we'll also assume a translation price of 81 cents per line. You can convert this directly to the number of pages that you have in your documentation. So in the worst case, in this example, you would need to translate 200 pages. Multiplied by 2, that gives you 400 pages of translation per year. At the cost that we have just assumed, this would result in translation costs of about 8,700 euros. So what would happen if you could reuse the existing translations as well and only need to translate what is actually new text? The translation effort that you need to make would be reduced by your reuse rate. So you would only have to translate 50 pages into 2 languages. That would give you 100 new pages to translate, and consequently your translation costs would drop down to about 2,100 euros. If you or your translation service provider uses a translation memory, you know the factor that reduces the costs by this system, and you can factor this into your calculation of the potential savings. So before you start calculating, of course it makes sense to scrutinize your assumptions and use data that you actually have in your own work. To do that, you could also refer to other departments. For example, design. Design will be able to tell you how many common components are used in your products. And then you can check whether these common components are relevant for documentation so that you can reuse texts for different products. Other hints may come from parts lists, purchased products or components, or identical functions of your products, including respective software. Based on these estimates, you can determine the possible development goals of your documentation. This was a brief overview on how you can quickly access the potential saving in your complete documentation. If you are interested in using our software SingleFeeder, we can provide you with a calculator which will do this calculation for you. To do that, just contact me and I can present you the system, and if you think that your documentation suits the system, I can provide you with that calculator and you can see what benefit would be in there for you. If you have other comments or feedback, just contact me. I'm happy to hear from you. I thank you for watching this video.